Welcome everyone to today's Performance Clinic, building the Unbreakable delivery pipeline. All the stuff you see today is on the GitHub repo that you see here. Please clone it, download it, and contribute. This is part of my Performance Clinic series. The recording will be up on Dynatrace University and also on the YouTube channel. If you have not yet received or gotten your Dynatrace SaaS tenant, go to the Dynatrace website or follow that bit.ly link, bit.ly/DT SaaS trial, and sign up for your trial. So you can do all the stuff that I'm showing today and also listen to our podcast that Brian Wilson and I have. And feel free to follow me on Twitter if you want. So today it's all about DevOps continuous delivery, building the Unbreakable pipeline. And I'm talked about this a lot. You know, there's different ways to visualize a pipeline from dev to ops. But I'm sure all of you that are either building, already having a pipeline, or building a pipeline, or considering to build a pipeline, you have a lot of different tools out there, depending on your technology stack, depending on your expertise, depending on stuff that you already have in your environment. I believe Dynatrace perfectly fits into the whole pipeline because we have the best data, and we give you the right data at the right moment, at the right phase of the pipeline into the tools to make the right decision on whether you push something forward, so to the right, or whether you have to stop something early on, shifting left, and fully automated and integrated into your tools. So I've been talking a lot about shifting right. Now the concept of shifting right, I'm sure people have different ideas, but for me, it is telling, in this case, Dynatrace, more about what you're actually pushing from left to right. So what are you deploying in your dev environment, in your test, in your staging, in your production environment? You can give metadata. And the more metadata, the more data Dynatrace has about what you do, the better it is to automate things in case things go wrong. This is my path to know of self-healing auto-remediation. That's one aspect of it. And then obviously it's shifting left. So using that data early on, using monitoring data early on in the pipeline to break the pipeline, because we want to stop bad code changes as early as possible. And also using the monitoring data obviously as actionable feedback loops. Now, one thing that I built, and you may have seen this on Twitter and LinkedIn when I promoted this tutorial, to show off how Dynatrace, and I'm not talking about Dynatrace, I'm not talking about AppMon, how Dynatrace, our full stack monitoring solution, fits into the DevOps pipeline. I chose AWS, but as I said earlier, this can be replaced with any other set of tools that you use, but I chose AWS. So here's what I built. Let's assume we have a developer that makes code changes, which then starts and triggers a pipeline. In my case, you will see we will start deploying the code change into a staging environment using AWS CodeDeploy. Now, one thing that I built every time when I push a deployment into any type of stage, I want Dynatrace to be aware of it. So I built a Lambda function that is actually pushing information about that deployment on the Dynatrace entities. So, oops, here we go. So Dynatrace will see on the services, on the processes, on the hosts, what deployment was actually just made by whom. So you will see this later on. We can define entities based on tags, and we can say, Dynatrace, I want you to know that on all of these services, that in all of these microservices of a particular name that have a particular tag on it, let's say staging, I want you to be aware of that we just deployed this particular version. And the build was deployed by, for instance, CodeDeploy, and here's all the details. So that's pushing Dynatrace deployment information. Now, when we deploy something into staging, you will see later on we will run some tests, and then eventually we need to approve if staging is good enough. Is the build we're pushing through good enough? And this is often a manual process. And actually also in the Amazon CodePipeline, you have a manual approval stage. And normally you would say, I look at the data after I deployed the build and run some tests, and then I compare it with historical data and see if it's good enough or not. Well, actually what I built, I built something automated. I don't want to manually look at dashboards and figure out, is this build good enough? So I built another Lambda function that actually goes off to Dynatrace, looks at the data from the current build we deployed, looks at key performance metrics. I call it my performance signature, a set of metrics, and compares it either with the previous build, with the current build in production, with my golden standard build, and then depending on how these metrics are looking, right, good or bad, I automatically reject or approve that pipeline stage. There's no need anymore to do things manually in our day of age, especially because we have all these APIs. Now let's assume we approve the pipeline continues, we deploy that new build into production. Same as before, we want Dynatrace to know that we just deployed a new build in production. Now the Lambda function is deploying that deployment information or pushing that deployment information to those services that Dynatrace knows represent the production environment. Right? What's next? Approve production. We deploy something in production and immediately we want to do some sanity checks. You know, how are things going? So again, we can use the same Lambda function that I've implemented in a way that is constantly validating, constantly verifying if a build needs to be validated. And then the Lambda function can say, okay, how is production right now after we deploy it, and how does it compare to the production environment we had before the deployment? It's a very simple automated sanity checks, looking at failure rate, response time, CPU utilization, all of this. Again, automatically approve or reject. Now, hopefully everything will be good and we are in the lucky situation that production runs without problems. But what if we missed something? What if a problem happens in production that was not caught by our quality gates in our pipeline? Well, in this case, as you know, Dynatrace automatically triggers a problem, an AI detected problem. And we could, of course, send emails. We could create a ServiceNow ticket, a PagerDuty ticket, an XMatters ticket, whatever we want to do. But what we can also do, we can trigger a self-healing or auto-remediation function. In my case, I implemented another Lambda function that will be called in case a problem is detected on my production environment. And then this Lambda function validates and looks at the Dynatrace data and says, hey, did we see a recent deployment on these services that are currently suffering from bad performance or high failure rate? And if so, take this data and tell AWS CodeDeploy to roll back the deployment. So basically go back to the previous state. Problem solved, back to the original version. Obviously feedback is sent to the developers as well. But this is kind of like my unbreakable pipeline. I have quality gates along the way, and in case I push something in production, something fails, I can execute auto-remediating actions. All the stuff that you see here is all on this GitHub repo, all the source code, everything is out there. So now, let me quickly go into a live demo before I explain the individual steps. And again, for those people that are online, feel free to ask questions. Put in questions into the question feature. All right, let me actually get started before I go to AWS. Here is the GitHub repo. All right, if you've never dealt with GitHub, just go to this URL, click on clone or download, and simply download the whole thing and make sure you put it somewhere on your disk. So in my case, I have everything here on my AWS DevOps tutorial. This is the complete source code, also the slides that we used last week at the training session. Everything is here. The only thing you don't have is the folder that's called Just for Andy. So download it and walk through it. I explain in detail what this is all about. I also explain all the prerequisites. You need an AWS account. You need a Dynatrace account. You can get everything for free. And then there's some prerequisite steps. I don't want to go through all the steps because I think I try to do a good job in explaining everything that needs to be done. So you need to create an S3 bucket and you need to copy over files. So just walk over it, okay? So hopefully this is self-explanatory, and give it a try. In case something is not as easy as I think it is, then leave me a comment here, hit me up on Twitter, or send me an email. Now let me go to my AWS environment. So what I did is I actually ran my CloudFormation stack. So on that GitHub repo, I have created what's called a CloudFormation stack, which is a description of all the different services that I want on Amazon. I called it the DevOps stack, so I created the stack and then ran it. And if you run it, you can actually see while it's running, it really did a lot of stuff. This is all the actions. So it started with creating an API gateway, some roles, some S3 packets, some parameters. It created another role. It created my Lambda function. So this is fully automated. So if you run that CloudFormation stack, everything will be fully automated created. A very important thing to look at after it's done is the outputs. Outputs tells you certain things that are important for you. For instance, my example creates two EC2 instances, one that is called production. So there's an EC2 instance where I later on deploy my app when I deploy it into production, and also staging. Also, there is a report endpoint. You will see later on I keep results for every single build I'm validating, and there's a little web UI for that. And here is also the endpoint that you need in case you configure the Dynatrace problem notification. So if Dynatrace detects a problem, this is the webhook endpoint that you have to configure to, right? So this is it. Now what I want to do, I have everything set up already, and I ran my pipeline multiple times. What I want to show you now is actually what you can do, or what you have to do to run a new build and simulate a new build. As part of the exercise, I'm asking you to create a so-called S3 bucket. I called it Egg Rabner Dynatrace DevOps. And this is where you have to upload a folder from my GitHub repo. There is the application itself, my Lambda function, my monspec file, which I explain in a second, and also my tests. And by default, the application that I've provided comes in 4 different versions or 4 different builds, and the default is version number 1. And I explain how you can simulate different builds. What I'm doing now, I'm quickly showing you, because I ran my pipeline earlier multiple times. I just want to show you how to simulate a new build. So I have a folder that is called app builds ready to deploy. And you can see here, this is how the folder looks like. There's build 1, 2, 3, 4. In my tutorial explanation, I tell you go use build 1, then build 2, build 3, and build 4. Every build has different problems. I ran through all of it already except build 4. So I'm copying my build 4, I rename it to app.zip, and then I'm just taking it and I'm uploading it. So this is for my pipeline, I chose S3 as my source repo. Normally we'll probably use something like GitHub or code commit. I just use S3. So now let me go to my code pipeline. Here is my code pipeline that was created automatically for me. It's called Sample DevOps Pipeline. I click on it, and you can see my pipeline has these stages. So source, then staging, then approve staging, then production, and then approve production. So it runs from top to bottom instead of left to right as I had it in my slides, but this is the way it's represented here. I configured the pipeline not to run automatically, but in order to run the pipeline, you have to click on release change. So what happens now, if I click on release change, it will basically say, okay, let me get the source that is in S3 and run it through the pipeline. This is what will happen. So I just want to trigger it now, and while this runs, I want to show you a little more what actually happens behind the scenes. And I see that questions are coming in, and that's great. And I will again try to answer them later on. Also, one thing I noticed, the UI in Amazon is okay, the web UI. Sometimes I had some refreshing issues, so sometimes I hit the release change button and nothing really happens. So sometimes you have to refresh the screen to really see what's going on. So what happens behind the scenes? Behind the scenes, what was actually what's happening, there's 2 EC2 instances. So here I am on my EC2 service. I have these 2 services, these 2 EC2 instances, Linux machines. One is called staging and one is called production. And these are the ones that my pipeline will use to really deploy the application first into staging, and once it's approved into production. And I'm using CodeDeploy for that. So in case you want to validate, here are these 2 EC2 machines. Now what's great is that a Dynatrace 1 agent is already installed on these machines, which means if I go back to my Dynatrace installation now, to my Dynatrace UI, what you see here is I have a staging and a production host. Now it shows up as staging and production because I also went through the optional configuration step of setting up AWS monitoring. So I also configured AWS monitoring of my AWS account, which is an optional step that is also described in the GitHub repo, which automatically pulls in all the tag information metadata from AWS. All right, if you don't do that, and if you click on hosts, these host names will have the internal EC2 host names. These are very long host names. If you set up that integration, then it actually shows the real name staging or production. That's the name that that is configured in EC2 itself. So now here's my staging environment, my Linux machine. As you can see here, Dynatrace automatically picked up all of these tags, knows everything, what's going on. Also, I can see which processes are running. I can see the log files that are created. I can go a step up and I see the processes that are running. So this is actually now my, my Node.js process that was deployed by the pipeline through AWS CodeDeploy. Right? Dynatrace automatically detected that this is a Node.js process. And what I've also done, I have asked CodeDeploy to pass on key information about the code deployment itself to that process so that Dynatrace can pick it up. So Dynatrace automatically knows this is the application name, this is the deployment group name and the deployment ID. If you don't use CodeDeploy, if you use Chef, Puppet, Ansible, then you can pass the same information from these configuration tools to Dynatrace. And this is very important because this helps me to properly tag my processes and my services, because I don't want to configure tags again in Dynatrace. I just want to extract it from the metadata I already have for my deployment. Okay, so these values are passed on from the deployment tool, and then Dynatrace can automatically extract it. And I have my Node.js service, so my Node.js process, and this process runs one service. And here's my service. It's called sample Node.js service. And here we go. So now this is my service that I have deployed or was deployed for me automatically in production. And as you can see here, properties, I see that it runs on this particular process. It is Node.js. This is the application ID. This is the Node version. And also what I've done is I have specified an additional rule to say every time Dynatrace detects a service that runs in the process that was deployed, I want the service to be tagged with the environment it runs in, staging or production. And I created a rule for that where I say, please, Dynatrace, if you detect a service, then look at the underlying process, because on the process, I asked my deployment tool to give me the deployment group name, like staging production. Okay, so this is stuff we can do through rules. I will show you this in a second once I go through the details. The key point here is I wanted to show you that if you run that tutorial, Dynatrace will automatically start monitoring your hosts, and once your pipeline runs through, it will also automatically see all the services, and it will also automatically see in which environments they run. So in my case, I have my Node.js running on staging and also in production. If I click on production, then here we go. Then this is now the same thing, but the service itself knows, hey, I'm running in production. How does it know it? Because we have a rule set up that says, please look at the underlying process. There is some environment information that tells me in which environment it is. So let me quickly show you that rule as well, because I think this is essential. This is one thing you need to configure as part of the tutorial. That rule is not automatically there. Under settings, under tags, there is a group or a section called automatically applied tags. This is where I created a group called deployment group, or a rule called deployment group. So this rule actually says, if I expand it, hey Dynatrace, on services, for services, please have a look at all those processes where we have the deployment group name environment variable set. So this is the environment variable that is passed on by CodeDeploy. And if it's existing on a process, then please take that value and apply it as a tag. So to reiterate what this rule is doing, hey Dynatrace, if you see a service, then please, like sample Node.js service, then please have a look at the underlying process where it actually runs, the physical process. And if that process has an environment variable or data with that name, deployment group name, then extract that value, staging, and apply it to the service itself, right? This allows me to easily differentiate between staging or production, between blue and green deployments. This is the magic, right? And everything, all this information comes from the deployment tools. All right, I hope this makes sense. Let me go back to my pipeline. So my CodePipeline, what is my CodePipeline doing right now? So it checked out the source code, the tests, also my monspec file, which I explain in a second. It deployed it into staging. So this is really just CodeDeploy, deploying the app into staging, and then setting these environment variables. Then I'm also using CodeDeploy to run some tests. I actually have a very simple test script that kind of runs endless loops and just executes a couple of URLs. What I'm also doing is I'm saying push Dynatrace deployment event. So what that is, that actually makes a Lambda call to Dynatrace and says, hey, I want you to be aware of this deployment. So what does this Lambda function actually do? It goes off. If I go back to Dynatrace, this is my staging. It actually posts this deployment information here. So it uses a REST API to say, hey, Dynatrace, I want you to be aware that we just deployed at 16:19, so that was like 6 minutes ago, we deployed this particular CodeDeploy application in this group. So this is a list of metadata we can pass on it. I hope this makes sense, right? So this is a great REST call. This is the times we have an events API. You can have a look at my at the Lambda functions. So behind here, if you click on the eye, you can see the function is called push Dynatrace deployment event. Let me quickly go to Lambda. We can actually see all these Lambda functions are there. So if I go to Lambda, then you will see, I have a couple of additional ones because I tested around a little bit, but the one we just looked at was the push Dynatrace deployment event. So all the source code is there. Have a look at it. All the source code is obviously also on GitHub. I tried to document as good as possible what I did. And basically this is just checking some input parameters, and then it is making a call to the Dynatrace REST API. And the calls to the Dynatrace REST API are really just HTTP calls. And please explore the functions. I know I've implemented this in Node.js, but you can equally do this in other languages, because really what it is, it's making REST calls. And in case you don't want to do the effort in converting that code into something like Python, I got good news for you as well. I already started with another GitHub project. So besides the AWS DevOps tutorial that I have, I also have a second one that is called the Dynatrace CLI. So it's the command line interface. It's a Python-based CLI where you can also push events to Dynatrace. So in case you're using Jenkins or Bamboo, you can just call these Python scripts, and that helps you and saves you some time. All right. So let's go back one step, and let's go back to my pipeline, CodePipeline. Let's see where the CodePipeline now actually is. So source staging. Actually, we want to probably look at the staging environment. Like what is the application actually doing? How do you know the application itself? Remember when we created the CloudFormation stack, here are the public DNS names. So staging and production. So I can just take this and paste it in here. And what I can see now, this is my sample app, and it says, congratulations, this is build number 4. So please don't judge me on my web UI skills. I copied this app from a sample that I got from Beanstalk and then modified it a little bit. The build number will obviously change, and also the background color. There's some really weird colors I picked, so please don't judge me on that. But the app is a Node.js microservice app, and you can execute different things. So for instance, you can click on echo, then basically whatever you put in here comes back. You can say, please request a certain URL. You can click on invoke, and what the service actually then does, it makes a call to Amazon.com, and then it returns me the HTTP status and the body length. I can also log in with a username. So this is something that can be used for real user monitoring, for Dynatrace real user monitoring. because as you know, once Dynatrace is installed on an app, we also do real end user monitoring. So we see every single action, and this automatically does user tagging. So later on, we'll be able to say, show me the user Joe Müller, and then we'll see it. Also some additional links here. Hopefully they are also helpful. So this is the app, and the load test that I'm running in the back is just executing a bunch of these different APIs. So this is my staging. If I go back to the build pipeline, so we actually deployed into staging, ran some tests, we pushed the information to Dynatrace about the deployment, and then there's another step, and this is a very critical one. It says register Dynatrace build validation. What this step does, it tells a Lambda function, again I'm calling another Lambda function, that hey, I have a build currently in staging, and I want Dynatrace, or I want somebody to automatically approve it. Not right now, because I'm just running a test, but after a couple of minutes. You see here in the user parameters where it says staging to production, 5, and approve staging. What these 3 parameters actually do, they tell my Lambda function, please put a request in that in 5 minutes, so after the load test ran for 5 minutes, this can obviously be a different time frame, but I chose 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, please have a look and compare the current data in my staging environment with my current production environment. And if everything is good, if staging is not worse than production, then approve staging. So the approve staging name actually refers to that particular step that is normally a manual approval stage. Now it gets automatically approved. All right? So this is what happened. Now you may wonder, okay, staging to production, what is this all about? So here is where the input artifact that you see up there comes in. I am a big proponent from configuration as code, whether it's infrastructure as code, configuration as code, or what I call monitoring as code. You see here I have my source of my application, my test source, but also a file that is called monspec. So what is monspec? Monspec is also part of the upload. So if you look at your S3 bucket again, where initially I asked you to upload app lambdas monspec, this is basically where you also have this monspec file. I opened it up here. So what is monspec? Monspec is a configuration file that lives next to your source code, where developers or architects or application teams can say, I have a service that I'm pushing through the pipeline. It is a service from a Dynatrace perspective. It could also be an application, a host, or a process group instance. And it will run in different environments. I will push it into staging, and I will push it into production. And the way Dynatrace detects, or the way you can use the Dynatrace REST APIs to get access to this component, is by simply looking at those service entities that have particular tags applied. This is why it was so important early on to specify these tags. So my Lambda function is actually looking at this and says, okay, that's cool. I know how to get access to these entities. Now comparison, if I scroll down, I have a section here that is called comparison. I have a comparison that is called staging to production, where I basically say my source is staging and I want to compare it to production. So please, Dynatrace, look at the data in those entities that you detect with this particular tag and compare it with those entities, with those services that have this tag on it. And if so, then I want you to add an additional factor, because this is something, the feedback that I got from our production team, where they said this is basically what we do internally too, but we have a scale factor. We are always comparing our pre-prod with prod, because we don't want to push anything from pre-prod into prod that is not at least as good as prod. But we also know that production has beefier hardware. There's more traffic on it. So that's why you can also specify a so-called scale factor. And you can have multiple of these configurations. So staging to production is one, staging to production yesterday is another one, staging to staging last hour, production to production. So you can configure different comparisons here. And then the last thing you want to obviously do is you want to say, what is my performance signature? So what are my metrics that I want you to compare? So for instance, the response time, average response time, and I want to make sure that it is not reaching the upper limit. You can specify this, and in this case, it would just simply take, for instance, staging and production, looking at the average response time, and then validate it. I also give you the option to specify hard-coded limits if you want to. So if you have hard-coded SLAs, this also works. And you can see here, it's also response time, the 90th percentile, or the average failure rate, or requests per minute count. So how many requests come in? What's the threshold there? Okay, so this is what I call MonSpec, and I believe this should live obviously next to your code. And then what this makes sure is every time you push something through the pipeline, if I go back to my pipeline, I push it through, then my Lambda function basically automates the very boring manual task of looking at two different dashboards of two different time frames or two different builds, and then making basically a visual comparison of is it better or worse. And this is what we're automating. And thanks to the Dynatrace API, this is possible, and thanks to the tagging, this is possible, fully automated. Now let's have a look at what's happening. Looks like staging was approved. Now production kicked in, deployed into production, deployed my test. So this is kind of like simulating my real user load. I pushed the deployment information. So I said Dynatrace, I just deployed this. And then I also registered another build validation. In this case, I asked Dynatrace, I want you to compare production right now with the production of last hour, because if I pushed something into prod, I want to make sure it's really not worse than what used to be in production earlier. And if everything is good, then you can please approve the step that is called approve production or reject it. And in this case, it actually seems it failed. So I can click on details now. And now Dynatrace tells me, we had one performance signature violation. Please check the results in the database where I keep the records, or just go to this report. So this is a report that I keep, and I can open it. And this is now, so every time my Lambda function is actually triggered and does the validation, I don't just want to approve or reject the result. I also want to give you full access to all the results. So I have all the results in a DynamoDB table, and then I build this little report here that gives me an overview. Okay, so this basically shows me all these measures, the average response time, the 90th percentile, the failure rate, and it always shows two values, right? The source and the comparison that you specified. Also the threshold, so whatever factor you gave it. And in case there's a violation, you see the violation cap. So it seems we had earlier today a violation, and just now this one violated because the failure rate went through the roof, right? It went from 0 to 2.88% failure rate, and that violated the build. All right, so fully automated. And this is the beauty, I believe, of the automation. We can stop a pipeline early by automatically comparing builds, right? I can also go back to staging. If I click on details here, even though it was approved, it says all performance signature validated successfully. But in case you want to still see all the results, then you can open up that report and you can see the historical data of all the builds that went through the staging phase. And it seems that 3-4 builds ago, we actually had a violation where also failure rate jumped to 20% or 16.67%. All right, so this is fully automated. I hope this makes sense. Please have a look at the complete tutorial. Also, what I have here, my slides, and I just noticed that I completely just went through the whole live demo. I will upload these slides as well to the GitHub repo, because here I'm explaining again what happens behind the scenes. So what happens during deployment. I explain that we can pass information to Dynatrace, right, whether it's through environment variables or through REST calls. And I'm also explaining in detail what actually happens in my pipeline. So in my case, I'm using AWS CodeDeploy, but it could be any other deployment automation tool. And I'm passing, in my case, I'm asking AWS CodeDeploy to pass context information via, for instance, the DT tags, the custom prop, or the cluster ID. And this is where it shows up. I showed you all of this in the demo early on, but here for your reference, everything documented, which environment variables to pass and where it shows up in Dynatrace, okay, passing metadata to the launch processes. Also, I mentioned this earlier, we can extract metadata from a process, for instance, and apply it to a service. In this case, from staging, from the process, it becomes a tag on the service itself through that to the service rule, and that works for staging and also for production. It's one rule, but it works for all of my environments. Also, what I showed you how to define that rule here again, in case you didn't catch it earlier, the way I defined that group, it's also explained in the GitHub repo. And then just explaining what actually happens. So if the Lambda function gets called for pushing deployment information, then we make the REST call, and everything shows up here on that service. And to kind of close the loop, how does my Lambda function know on which entities? Well, because remember we have this monspec file. So actually when I call the push Dynatrace deployment information, when I call that Lambda function, I tell it, please push that deployment information to those entities that run in the staging environment. Okay, and therefore I make a REST call to Dynatrace saying only push this information to services that have these tags on it. Okay. All right. Now, quickly a recap behind the scenes, and I'm almost done, and I see questions are coming in. The approval stage, I showed it to you. Really a big shout out. I got inspired by this by our own teams at Dynatrace, and also in discussions I had last week at Perform with other companies. They also do similar things. So what our team internally does, every build, they look at key metrics. They call it the performance signature, so key metrics of a service. And what they basically do, they put it in a report. For every single build, they are tracking these metrics, right? Every single metric. And in case there's a regression, meaning a regression either with the previous build or with the approved last build, like the golden standard or the baseline build, then they show it here in this table. And I thought this is exactly what I want to do. You saw it earlier, but as a recap, in this monitoring as code file, or monspec as I call it, you define an entity, you define where it runs, for instance, in staging and in production, and Dynatrace knows based on these tags, for instance, that this is staging and this is production. You can define metrics, right? Let's start with one metric, response time. You define a comparison. I showed you this earlier, staging to production, and also a factor. Now what happens automatically, we use the REST API to say, what's the response time in staging? What is it in production? Apply the scale factor, and then is it good or not good? Does it fall within that category, within that threshold, yes or no? And if we do this not only for one metric, but for multiple metrics, and if we actually give you the option to compare it not only with one environment, but you can give multiple configurations, then we can fully automate this comparison in a complete pipeline with different stages. And this is what it looks like, right? You saw my report earlier. My report is nothing else than visualizing the results of a particular comparison of a particular entity and then each individual metric. And you saw this, good build, good build, good build, bad build, all the bad builds are here. And the bad build would have also triggered a rejection of the pipeline stage, and the good build, the approval. That's it. I showed you how the configuration looked like. So this is the Lambda function that is basically saying, hey, Dynatrace, I want you to validate, or Lambda function, please validate in 5 minutes the staging versus the production, and then approve it. And this is the configuration. Now, a little magic behind the scenes is the following, because this is obviously it's asynchronously, right? I mean, I'm running a test, and if I say compare it in 30 minutes, I cannot start a Lambda function right now and basically say run for 30 minutes and then validate. Now, I stole this idea or borrowed the idea, the way I implemented it from a session I saw at AWS reInvent last year. So my register, the Lambda function I'm calling here is actually called register Dynatrace build validation. And what it does, it puts an item into a database that basically says, hey, I have somebody, this pipeline wants me to validate this time frame, here's the monspec file, here's the comparison definition name that they want me to compare, and in case you get to do the comparison and in case you do all this, then please reject or approve the action. So it gets put into a database, and then what I'm using, and again, this is the idea that I kind of borrowed from the gentleman at AWS reInvent, I have a CloudWatch event that triggers another Lambda function, let's say every minute, every 5 minutes. So this Lambda function is basically saying, hey, do we have some entry, do we have somebody that wants us to validate a build, and is the time right? Did enough time pass? If so, pull the data from Dynatrace to the REST API, do the comparison, write the results back to the table so that we can build our nice report, but also either approve or reject that stage that is also referenced. All right, so this is fully asynchronous but fully automated, and I love this. And again, this also works, I'm sure, with all the other pipeline tools out there as well, whether you use Lambdas and Node.js or whether you use Python scripts or whatever you use. I think it's a cool concept and a nice way of doing it. All right, and you saw how it looks like when it's approved and when it's rejected, and you have the link in there. And this is your report that we also saw earlier. And more information about the monspec file that I also showed you. Specify your entities, your environments, you specify your comparisons, it's all there, and you specify your metrics. Again, I'm glancing over this rather fast. These slides will be uploaded in a second. After I'm done with my presentation, they get up to GitHub, and then you can also get these slides. Last point is self-healing. So I've talked about this a lot, but if we deploy something in production and we missed a problem in our pipeline, this can happen. Now what Dynatrace does, our AI opens up a problem. It allows us to obviously notify our regular incident management chain, whatever tool you use. But more importantly, we can do smart remediation. So we have the full chain of events. And instead of, let's say, rebounce a server or scale up and down depending on a symptom, we can call our self-healing or auto-remediation function, whether it's Chef, Puppet, Ansible, whether it's Lambda, like in my case. And then we can look at all the details, all the events that Dynatrace automatically found for that particular problem that is impacting my easytravel.com here, the high JavaScript error rate. And then depending on what we see, we can execute better remediation actions. So maybe there was a CPU exhausted on a service that saw more load. Well, let's add a new instance. Hey, there was high garbage collection, and we know that somebody messed around with the garbage collection settings because they wanted to try something else. Let's revert these settings. There's an issue with the blue deployment versus the green. Let's switch back. There's a hung thread. Well, let's restart that service. If anything of this fails, or if any of these actions actually solve the problem, we can also update your Jira ticket or whatever ticketing system you have to say, we executed these steps and it mitigated the problem. If the mitigation does not work, well, then maybe we initiate a rollback and mark that pull request is bad. So if a developer comes in at 8 o'clock in the morning, they know that their code change has been pulled out after trying all the other steps that didn't work. And if everything still fails, obviously we can still escalate. Now, how did I implement this with my example here? When we deploy into production, we push the deployment information to Dynatrace. So Dynatrace knows we deployed this particular revision through CodeDeploy at this particular time. If a problem happens, I'm connecting this with my Lambda function. So the Lambda function gets called. The Lambda function is using the REST API to get more information about what else happened. Right? Hey, there was a deployment 5 minutes ago. And I have the deployment information. I have the version that was deployed. I know what was the previous version because I can use the REST API to CodeDeploy, and then I can deploy the previous revision, and I can also put that comment on the Dynatrace problem ticket, so whoever looks at Dynatrace knows, hey, it seems that the auto-remediation self-healing function kicked in and deployed the previous build. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. You can simulate some different builds as I showed you earlier with my application. So there's 4 builds that are built into this sample. Build number 1 is no problem. Build number 2 always have 50% of requests return an HTTP 500 error. Build 3 is a good build again. And build 4 is good in staging, so it makes it through staging, but 10% of requests will fail in production. So that's a use case where, hey, it made it all the way through production, but then production will fail. And I showed you earlier how we can simulate these builds. All right. I have some additional features that I also love. You may have you've not seen it here, but you've seen it that my service is called sample Node.js service, and the tag tells me is it staging or production. I can add an additional service rule, service naming rule to actually rename that service. So the service actually, the name itself is descriptive enough to tell me, hey, this is my production and my staging. And here is the service rule that you can specify. All right, under settings, service naming rule, we could say, hey, Dynatrace, if you find a service where the process has this particular environment variable, then just extract that variable and add it to the service name. All right, so that's an option. And the last thing I want to show you, I love the fact that we automatically do log monitoring. So we automatically see every log message that is written by all of our processes. Now I built a little special feature into my app. If you're opening up the browser and browse to your app and go to /API cause error, this will cause a severe log message. And now we can create a Dynatrace log event that says every time when we see the app writing a log entry that contains this particular text, then please trigger an error, right? Because this might be a severe thing. So we can actually use our logging capabilities to automatically open up a problem in case a very severe log message or a particular log message is written. All right, cool. That's it. Just reminders, and then we go into Q&A. There is a lot of stuff happening. There's meetups, there's user groups. Check out our events. I'm actually doing this particular workshop I just did on site in different locations in the next weeks. I'm doing it in Atlanta, in Columbus, in Denver, and in Minneapolis. So we're doing a 3 hours workshop where we run through the whole thing together. And there's also other meetups and conferences where we are. In case you are in Europe, our team in Europe is hosting dev1.at. From my perspective, one of the best developer conferences when it goes around development, operations, high scalability, performance. As one of the speakers this year, we have Kelsey Hightower, in case you know who this gentleman is. It's an amazing lineup that we have there. There's more online material, and also another shout out to our own podcast. All right, now I am shutting up, at least from my perspective, on the stuff that I want to tell you. But now I am opening up for Q&A, and I'm turning on my video cam again. Hopefully now you've seen most of the stuff that was important, and now I'm taking a little bit of your screen away. All right, let's see. In the case in which you have deployed to production and find a problem after the initial performance validation has passed, would it be possible to make the rollback require an approval so someone could decide if the problem requires a rollback? I think you can. So if you deploy it into production, so one thing that I thought is that I have not yet implemented. If I go back to my pipeline, where's my pipeline? So I thought I want to, what I should do is my production validation is right now only looking at performance metrics, right? I basically deploy into production and then I say, is it better or worse than before? I think I want to extend this, and especially in production, I also want to look at if problems came in, because problems can show up on metrics that you may have not specified here. So I want to extend my Lambda function, my handler that is actually looking for, that is notified when a problem happens, and says, hey, there's a problem in the production and the pipeline is still kind of in the approval phase, but I want to reject it right away because this is a bad thing. Now, if you want to add an additional manual approval, I'm sure, I think the way you would probably do it, you would define a different pipeline that you would trigger. So a problem happens and you suggest a rollback, but instead of doing it automatically, you just start another code pipeline that is, as the first step, has a manual approval of the rollback. I think that's what I would do. Okay, Mike, hopefully this makes sense. Okay. Staging, next question, staging to production Lambda function. How does DT compare performance of staging with performance of production? Staging may have a very small load. I hope I explained this earlier. Oh yeah, you said the monspec file. Exactly. So let me go back. If staging and production, you can specify this factor here, right? So I have a default factor that would mean, hey, staging can, on all the metrics, be 15% slower, but for other metrics, so for instance, requests per minute, it can be 90% less. So this would mean in production, I have 9 times the load. That's why in staging, when I'm validating throughput, if I can reach the throughput, I can be 90% lower because I'm just simulating less load. Okay. Hopefully this explains it. We still have on-premise presence and are minimal using AWS or other cloud providers. Can we leverage these capabilities through the REST API CLI for our enterprise? Yes, Mike. You can. The REST API for me is beautiful. Honestly, it's beautiful. It's amazing. You can do so many things. And let me just show you. Google for Dynatrace API. All right. Here's the API. That is the documentation. The API is a REST API. You can call REST APIs with anything, right? A curl script, it can be a Java function, it can be a Java code, it can be anything. You can have full access to time series, so you can push data and pull data. You have access to problems. You can push events. These are the deployment events and custom annotations, as we call them. You have full access to the Smartscape data. You have full access to you have access to run data as well. I mean, everything is there. And I know I implemented this use case and showcase with AWS and Node.js and Lambda, but this works. The only thing I built is a little boilerplate code that is connecting the AWS services with Dynatrace, right? And I think I mentioned this, that I have my other browser somewhere. I have my CLI. So my CLI that I built, and I should spend more time on it because there's so much new stuff that came up in the APIs in the last couple of months. But the CLI itself is, it's also spitting out reports if you want to, but I implemented this in Python. It's a Python script. Yeah. Is it possible with AppMon? So AppMon is obviously, different product. AppMon also has a couple of really cool REST APIs. AppMon also has a feature that is called test automation. So if you have AppMon and you stick with AppMon for whatever reason and you don't want to move to Dynatrace, check out the Dynatrace test automation feature where we are able to compare individual builds. This is built into AppMon. But also AppMon has a very good REST API where you can pull out any type of dashboard. So you can build a dashboard in Dynatrace, put all of your metrics on it that you want, and then you can pull it out through the REST API. May I attend the 3-hour workshops being planned in the US? Sure. So the information about the workshops that I mentioned earlier, so these workshops that we're doing in Atlanta, Columbus, Denver, and Minneapolis. This is second week of March and first week of April. I'm sure the information and the registration will be up in the next couple of days on our website. So keep an eye on the events page, and then very happy to if you join me. Cool. All right. Let's see if there's anything else. Let me see what time it is. Huh. Almost at top of the hour. And I see some faces or some names here that were also last week at Perform. So thanks again for joining us last week. I think we got a lot of great feedback from you, and it keeps us motivated to continue the path we are on, because we believe we're on the right path to help you guys all in building better software and running larger systems and more dynamic systems. Right? All right. I think I give you 30 more seconds if there are any other questions. If questions come up later on, answers.dynatrace.com. Okay, that's our discussion forum. Also, make sure that you keep an eye on university.dynatrace.com, where the recording will go up, and also the other playlist that shows here, the YouTube playlist, the One Agent tutorials. This is the one where the recording will be uploaded as well to YouTube. Good. And the last thing, because I just had to chuckle last week. Somebody approached me last week at Perform and said I look like 25, even though on television or on YouTube I look much older. Well, I'm not 25 anymore, but thanks for the compliment. Having that said, thank you. Next week we do a performance clinic on real user monitoring. So check this out. David Jones, Jonesy, he's doing a clinic on how to leverage our real user monitoring. Thank you and bye-bye.